Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ruminations. My name is Jason. I'll be your host for today. My guest today is a little special to me, and to start off, I need to tell a little bit of a story.
A story?
A story, yes. This goes all the way back to when I was first a freshman, back in the fall of 2019.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you come on campus, it's a very... how do I put it? Frightening experience. You're always very nervous about what's going on. And sometimes you just have that one professor who just makes you feel at home. And regardless of how you feel about the school, you know, years down the road, it's always, I remember that one professor. They made me feel really good. I don't regret coming here because of that. This is my professor for me. She's been a mentor for me for pretty much all 4 years that I've been here. Also now the current chair of the SU Psych Department. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Whitfield.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Busy, you know, like many of your listeners probably. You know, looking forward to, I'm kind of looking forward to Thanksgiving, although it's also letter of rec writing time for faculty. So it's kind of a break to have a little, you know, Thanksgiving in the middle, but it's also kind of a busy time. But that's all right. It's a change.
Right.
Change is good.
How's the fall quarter been for you? You know, we're sort of getting into this, I don't want to say necessarily post-pandemic, but things are clearly
Dude,
changing.
I find it amazing how easily we take for granted things that we pined for like a year ago, 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, we started the quarter, we still had to wear masks in class, right? And now it's optional.
Right.
Which is great. And I am so now used to just being able to move about without having to worry about, oh, do I have a mask? Da, 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 da. And so I think every time I have that awareness, I try to force myself to remember how thankful I am that, you know, oh, hey, we can actually sit across from each other, you know, without masks indoors.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
What a concept.
It's like maybe like even just 1 year ago, that would have been impossible. Or
Yes.
not impossible, but unsafe.
A year ago, that was, fall 2021. We were still wearing masks pretty much everywhere inside.
Right.
So, so it's nice. And, you know, so you mentioned I'm department chair. So one of the things, so I'm a senior lecturer at Santa Clara, which means we teach typically 7 courses a year. So it's like 2, 3, 2, or 2, 2, 3, or whatever. When you're department chair, you get course releases so that you're not teaching as much. So this year I'm teaching one regular class that Jason's in, Stats Methods 3. In psych, and also teaching the psych honors class, which only meets once a week. And so that's only a half class. But, you know, next quarter, I'm going to teach one class. And in the spring, I'm only going to teach that 1/2 honors class. Mm-hmm. And that's great because as chair, you know, you have a lot of things to do. You have constant email and, you know, have to put out little fires and things like that. But the thing that is really cool about like when I come into 53 every day is I really get recharged from that class.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You might not get recharged from that class. Other students might not get recharged from that class. But every time I'm in there, I remember why I'm at a place like Santa Clara because I just really love teaching. Tops. Teaching is tops.
Interesting.
So my fall has been good only because I am really grateful for, you know, all the closeness that we can have now. And also because I realize how much I like teaching.
Right. Yeah, it's honestly really strange for me too. You know, going from freshman year, it was very easy to be close in the classroom. There was less, obviously there was no COVID. And then all of a sudden come, I want to say February or March, we kind of just...
like March 13th or something like that.
Right. And everything just kind of swapped over. And personally, I remember thinking, oh, this is great. We don't have to go to class for like 2 weeks. It's almost like an extended spring break. And then it kind of just kept going and going and going and going and going.
Yeah.
And it's so weird seeing, you know, we were fully in person up until COVID. Then we went to Zoom, entirely
Right.
Zoom, and it was kind of awful, to be honest.
Yeah,
And then
it was terrible. I agree.
And then there was kind of like this hybrid thing where
Yeah.
sometimes you would go in class and sometimes it would be online.
That was also terrible.
Right. And then I think it was around the mid-endish of 2021 where we could actually go back in person, obviously still wearing masks. And
Yeah.
And now it's sort of, well, we don't have to wear masks anymore.
Right.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, at least for you, how has teaching for you changed throughout the pandemic?
Well, okay, so there's the obvious, you know, oh my God, how am I going to teach this online? And it sometimes it's kind of weird when you look back. It's like when you have periods of your life that were really busy and you did amazing things but you're not doing them anymore. And you look back and go, wow, how did I do that? It kind of feels like that at this point. It's like, wow, we just like, and because it happened so abruptly, you know, like week 10 of winter quarter 2020 is when this flip happened. And, you know, I remember the administration telling us, okay, we're going to give you, you know, week 0, which is the normal week 1 is now going to be, you know, we're not having a week 1
right,
because you need more time to prep. So that was great because faculty at least had 2 weeks to prep before we came back for spring quarter. But it was just so surreal, like okay, I've got to figure out how to do everything and, you know, try to make the best possible experience that I can for students. At a place like Santa Clara where you're really valuing the connection with students in person, it was just not ideal. And, you know, we got through it. And I think one thing that we did during the pandemic as faculty is, okay, if you have prepped, you know, a Zoom style class for like Psych 2, you're just going to do that again. Because normally, you know, faculty might have, you know, let's say 4 different courses to prep during the year. During the pandemic, Dr. Bell, Matt Bell was the department chair during the pandemic, bless him. He was like, okay, we're just going to try to, if you've prepped materials for a Zoom class, you're just going to keep teaching that class more than you would normally would. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of good because we were able to get a little bit of a kind of learning curve and figure out what worked and what didn't work. But just the lack of interaction with people and, you know, there were definitely equity issues that came to light among students about,
right,
you know, people whose Wi-Fi just didn't work and they couldn't really do anything about it. Mm-hmm. People who were in really, really busy households where they couldn't get any private space. People who were in really not busy households where they felt isolated.
Right.
And that was also hard to watch and know that was going on. So, yeah, I just feel really lucky that, okay, we have vaccines now. You know, we figured the mask thing out. It's just, yeah, it was just weird. I think the farther we get away from it, the weirder it's going to seem. Like, wow,
right,
we did that.
Right.
But, you know, students are obviously still carrying that around with them, right? That hasn't gone away. The people that are seniors now, like yourself, you know, that was a kind of a trauma of sorts for people, you know?
Right. Yeah, it's really strange, like, how much we take for granted, not only just, like, obviously in-person social, like, contact, but also the fact that this space kind of exists in and of itself to be able to take class and to learn or teach.
Yeah.
Like, when, you know, you do a lot of things at home, not only are you isolating yourself in this space, but there's also now so many different things that you didn't really have to think about when you were actually, like, going to school, going to class. You go to class, there is a space for you to just do class.
Right.
While over COVID, there wasn't really that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it made for a really interesting experience. There were definitely some things personally as a student that I really enjoyed about taking things online, specifically just the flexibility and convenience of a lot of it.
Right.
But obviously speaking, I think it was definitely much harder to focus. It was much harder to actually learn the material. But I guess one thing that's interesting to me was, at least thinking about it in hindsight, would there have been a better way to handle the online sort of class environment?
I don't know. I think people tried different solutions depending on what their course was and what they were comfortable with. Something that I did for most of my classes is had like one day of the week when the whole class would meet. And like my largest class would have been Psych 2, so like 45 students, which is, that's, there's this new metric, right? How many Zoom screens is that? Okay, that's 2 Zoom screens worth of students.
Right.
And so one of the things that I did is I met with my class one day, the whole class. And I would try to do little, interactive things. So I would talk for a little bit, and then I would put people in breakout rooms, blah, 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 right? And then on Wednesday and Friday, I would meet for 30 minutes. So like on Wednesday, 30 minutes, Friday, 30 minutes with smaller groups of students, so that at least people could have, that closer experience. And I felt like that was the best solution that I could think of at the time. I don't know, given that we really at the time had no defenses against that thing, right? And we really just couldn't be with each other. I don't know what we could have done any differently. I mean, obviously now we're way more prepared if other stuff like that comes up. But I don't know that we could have done anything differently.
Right.
I would hope that now, like, God forbid, another variant comes along and, we start infecting each other to massive degrees again. I would hope that we would find a way to not have to go back fully into online learning.
Right.
Maybe we could do, I don't know. For me, the hybrid was almost worse than fully online, because trying to teach, you kind of had to design 2 different classes and yet have them both, participating and doing the same quote unquote assignments, even though they really weren't.
Right.
And, the technology is just really not set up for that. So yeah, that winter 2022. Oh my God, winter 2022. So almost a year ago, when we had, okay, everybody, we thought the pandemic was over, but it's not. So stay away for 2 weeks. Oh, just kidding. Stay away for 4 weeks.
Right.
And so half the class was like in the class and half was, online.
Right.
That was crap.
Right.
I hated that.
Right.
And I really don't I think it almost would have been better if I had known we were going to be off, online for 4 weeks with some of the people. I don't know.
Would have probably just been
I might have just said, okay, everybody's on for 4 weeks, even though people so wanted to come back.
Right.
That I really wanted students who wanted to come in person to be able to come back.
Right.
And I had an 8 a.m. that quarter, and students showed up for the 8 a.m., man.
Damn.
During during this little hybrid pandemic. So people were really craving it. I was craving it. But I think it was in some ways worse.
Interesting. Yeah, it probably would have just been better to, put everyone on the same track.
Yeah, because I really felt like the people that were doing the hybrid Zoom experience, it wasn't good. It wasn't good.
Yeah, I do think, though, that at least from experience, the sort of online environment definitely got better as the pandemic went on. I would hope that at least if something like this were to ever happen again, we would probably be a little more prepared to do some sort of hybrid learning. But the fact that it all sort of had to be done on the spot, that was sort of what made it really tricky.
Yeah.
Though I do have to say as well, I remember taking your Psych 2 class over the pandemic. And if I'm to be honest, I don't remember too much about that time.
Yeah.
But I can say at least I remember that sort of method being a little more effective. Because obviously speaking, lecturing to as you said, 2 Zoom screens of students probably isn't super effective.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are some things where you just have to get the information out and then
Right.
just work in smaller groups on discussions and stuff.
Yeah.
Breakout rooms were definitely a huge miss for everyone, sort of, because obviously we were trying to create like small, intimate environments where people could work. But in reality, it just ended up being no one would talk.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot there. So,
Yeah.
hopefully, if this were to ever happen again, God hope it doesn't.
Yeah.
But hopefully, if this ever happens again, we won't have to go with those sorts of things.
It's interesting. We have like this whole vocabulary now of like, you hear the phrase breakout room, and I think all the students that were here during that time have like this emotional response to that.
Right.
Like breakout rooms. Oh.
Yeah. It's, I'm sure we'll be more prepared moving forward. But yeah, that time was definitely interesting to say the least.
I mean, I'm not panicked about it now. Like when I think about it happening again, I think, okay, that would really suck, but okay, I would know what to do.
Right.
I would know what to do. So yeah.
Yeah, being more prepared on that will definitely help.
Yeah.
Though, to pivot over to something less depressing to talk about, so obviously you're a psych professor, and this was something that I was really curious about because I personally get this a lot in my day-to-day whenever people ask, oh, hey, what major are you? And I say, I'm a psych major.
Yeah.
Usually the question that I almost always, without fail, get is, oh, do you psychoanalyze me? Or
Yes.
do you know what I'm thinking?
Yes.
I was just wondering, do you get the same thing too?
Not at Santa Clara, but yeah, like if I am, with a crowd of adults who aren't that familiar with the field of psychology broadly, everyone thinks you're a therapist.
Right.
And most people don't, unless they've had therapy, they don't necessarily know what therapy is. So there's all kinds of misunderstanding about that. So I'm a developmental psychologist and I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist. So sometimes if I just didn't want to deal with it, I would say I'm a cognitive scientist, and then they would pretty much just like not ask me anything else.
Right.
So that's good. Or sometimes I would say, like people say, oh, what do you do? And I'll say, oh, I teach child development at Santa Clara University. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if you mention child development, then they go off on a thing about, am I screwing up my kids and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So I don't know. I think whenever you say you're a psychologist of any kind, people always feel a little bit self-conscious about whether they're, doing things right. I'm using the air quotes, people.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of interesting in that regard because I feel like, not a lot of people really know what psychology is.
Yeah.
Though I guess that also begs the question, since obviously when you are a psychology major or when you are a psychologist, you do work with a lot of people and see a lot of things or like trends or whatever. How much would you say you really know about a person at like first impression, or like how much can you really get off of someone off maybe first impression or just like a small interaction?
I personally think very little. Right? Like, I know, what's his name? Malcolm Gladwell wrote that book about how, you can assess things really fast.
Right.
I don't know, and I don't know the literature on this very well, but like in my personal experience, there have been people that I know that I thought were, oh, I think you're like this. And then I got to know them a little bit better. I'm like, yeah, that was totally situational.
Right.
So there's the social psychology answer. It's all context. It's all situational. Mm-hmm. I think unless you hang out with people and talk to them for quite a while, it's hard to get to know like who they're, people don't even know who they are themselves.
Right.
Right. So like, I guess in terms of, when someone says, oh, are you psychoanalyzing me? I'm not psychoanalyzing you any more than any other human being is constantly making judgments about any other human being about how they think they are.
Right.
Which is really not a good practice, but, that's kind of the human gig, right? That's how we are.
Right. We're kind of predisposed to judge people,
Right.
regardless of whether we want to or
are
not.
built for judging.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, at least for me. I like to think that I have a decent grasp on how people act or think or whatever. But then just out of nowhere, people surprise you very often, right? Like
Yeah.
you can put people into boxes or even stereotypes based on things that you've already seen or know to an extent. But then, there might be like that one instance or moment where they sort of act completely outside of that. And then it's like, wow, I don't actually know them at all.
Right. Right.
It's like there's only so much you can get off of that.
Yeah.
Which, now that we're on the topic of misconceptions about whether it's psych or how people perceive psychology, this is a very broad question, but what is psychology exactly?
What is psychology? Well, it's funny you ask that, Jason, because we actually have in the psych department, the field is so broad, and it's a field that touches lots of other disciplines at its edges.
Right.
And so once you get out to the edge, it's like, okay, at that edge, is it really still psychology, or is it really economics? Is it really still psychology, or is it really neuroscience?
Right.
And so many people may not know that in alumni science, in our building, that's where the psych department is. And we used to have, our neighbors in there used to be bio and chem, and they have moved over to the new science building.
Right.
And so we are going to be getting new neighbors, child studies and public health in our building. And so we talked about like, okay, it's going to be a new neighborhood. Like, what's the neighborhood going to be called? And so there's all this kind of back and forth about like, okay, is it social science? Well, there's people in the psych department that are like, I don't have anything to do with social behavior. Mm-hmm. And then other people that say, well, how about behavioral science? But, there's people in public health that say, yeah, we don't really want to emphasize individual behaviors. We want to talk more about, structures in society and how they produce health inequities and things like that. It's not just all about the individual. So I don't even know what it is. And then there's people that study humans and there's people that study animals.
Right.
Right. And that's all under the umbrella of psychology.
Right.
So most of us, most of us look at behavior as output. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's a pretty key part of psychology, is that you're studying behavior. Some of us make inferences about mental events, but we can really only make those inferences based on how people behave or what they tell us.
Right.
Right. We can measure brain activity and things like that. And I guess we could call that a form of electrical behavior. And then we can relate it to, actions and things that people say. But there's other disciplines that use those same techniques and tools that are not psychology. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I get that. Like, personally, as a psych major, I sort of went into psychology thinking of a very specific box of it, like specifically mental health. You know, a lot of psychology obviously relates to that in some way. But then, as I kept taking more and more classes, specifically the statistics and methods class, like that entire track, I was sort of now thinking, okay, why exactly are we taking this? Is this just for specifically to get us into research? Is there something like, but then I sort of realized like there's a big part of psych that isn't just, researching mental health or researching specifically like the typical psych things. Like there's the whole avenue of UX and how, users interact with technology and interact with different devices. And that's psychology. Right. But that's also completely unrelated to mental health.
Exactly.
but they're still under the same umbrella.
Yeah. It's a big umbrella.
Right. And I think it's really weird because then psychology is obviously very important. It is in kind of everything that we do. But since it's so broad, it kind of starts to almost lose its meaning.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. It's very strange, trying to talk to someone about what psychology is.
I mean, I guess, historically speaking, psychologists have focused on the behavior of the individual.
Right.
So, but behavior of the individual in what context? We haven't limited ourselves to the context in which we study human behavior. Whereas, economics has this whole behavioral economics wing of itself that is pretty much psychology.
Right.
Right? Like Tversky and Kahneman, the two people that won a Nobel Prize in economics for their work on how human beings make decisions, that we don't make decisions like computers. They were psychologists, right? And behavioral economics grew out of that field. So now you could say, well, but economists look at the behavior of individuals. And sometimes I get defensive about our field, right? Like I'll listen to a podcast or something. Like I really like this Freakonomics MD podcast with Bapu Jena, who talks about economic questions in medicine. I love that podcast. And second to yours, Jason.
Thank you.
And a lot of the stuff that he talks about in there is like, well, that's not really economics, that's psychology.
Right.
Or like, yeah, what are you guys doing studying that? That's not your domain, that's our domain. Well, yeah, but you know what? If your domain is so broad that you include everything, then you can't really claim everything for yourself. Right. So, but yeah, I guess individual human behavior is kind of our domain. And typically, like the people that do animal research, most of the animal research that's done probably gets funded because the person can convince people that, oh, this is going to help human beings, right?
Right.
Like we're very species centric that way.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that would be my definition.
Right. I guess to follow up on that, how do you feel about that definition? Do you feel like that's a good place for psychology to be? Do you feel like it should be broader, more specialized, or
I think it's plenty broad.
Right.
Right. And I don't know. I don't know that do we really need the categories? Right.
Right. I guess the way that I'm sort of seeing it is psychology sometimes gets a bad rep for what it is and what it isn't. Like as much as I would like to say, oh yeah, people respect psychology.
Yeah, I don't think people do respect psychology.
Right.
And I think they don't. Well, I don't know why they don't, but you hear the phrase hard science. Right? Soft science.
Right.
And I think it comes from the fact that a lot of people outside of psychology believe, well, how could you possibly measure that? Right? Well, guess what? We've been measuring human behavior successfully for a while. I mean, we're still a really young discipline compared to things like bio and chem and stuff like that. It's just no measurement of anything is ever going to be perfect.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's just that human behavior, we're really complex organisms. And so there's never going to be a single cause for any behavior. And I think because we're complex organisms and everything you do is always going to be multiply caused, people just kind of throw up their hands sometimes and be like, well, you can't possibly measure human behavior because it's too complex. Well, let's try. Right? And so psychology is about trying. And that's okay as long as we acknowledge that, again, there's not ever going to be a single cause. And I think the popular press is really into the single cause, right?
Right.
Like they really want there to be one reason why people become unsheltered. One reason why that person, did the school shooting.
It makes a good headline.
And it's so stupid.
Yeah.
And so psychology is inherently about multiple causes, and any one cause really only explaining a little teeny bit of the variability, because there's 50 other causes that we also need to study. And so I think part of why it is considered, soft is that it's just hard to study. It's just really hard. So ironically, we should be called the hard science because it's difficult to study human behavior when human beings are so dynamic,
Right.
And people behave really differently in different contexts. So, you got that whole element, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's really interesting too, given how, prevalent psychology is in everything from marketing to economics to mental health to even something as simple as the colors that you use
Right.
in a space when you're trying to paint a room.
Right.
But obviously people use those things, but they don't respect the justification behind it. And it's kind of paradoxical in that regard.
I think that psychologists are probably not very good at promoting ourselves. And I think that, I don't know. I kind of feel like, how there's probably a lot of bench biologists out there who feel like MDs get a lot of respect and they don't.
Right.
Right. Because the science behind medicine is not the same as medicine. Just like the science behind psychotherapy is not the same as psychotherapy.
Right.
But I think that the application, whether it's psychotherapy or, medicine, that people interface with that more directly.
Right.
And so I think that it's just not as, it just doesn't get promoted as much in the media.
Right.
Like what are psychologists actually doing behind the scenes? I think it's gotten better. Like there's all these shows now on Netflix about, how your brain works and things like that. And I think people are getting more educated about, those sorts of questions. But I don't know that if you stopped the random person on the street and showed them a clip of one of those shows about like how your perception works or something, if they would know, who did that work? Psychologists.
Right.
Like I think they would still think a psychologist is someone that you go to when you have mental health problems.
Right. Right.
So.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point there about how sort of psychologists aren't the best at like sort of communicating themselves or their ideas.
Yeah.
I guess it kind of also extends to just science as a whole, not just really psychology, where you can have a bunch of facts, you can have a bunch of things that, you do a lot of research on, but if you can't fully communicate your ideas, then all of a sudden those ideas sort of fall apart.
Yeah.
Even if it's unintentional, that's kind of the way that it goes.
Right.
Which, if we extend this even broader just to the conversation within media about, the facts or truth, or we saw it a lot with the COVID pandemic. God bless Dr. Fauci and his defense of everything. But, misinformation comes so easily and it's so accessible.
Yeah.
While when it comes to the truth of what people do, what the science or like what science goes on, it's much more inaccessible. And because of that, it's a little harder to really communicate with people.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons it's inaccessible is that, in science, we speak using terms conveying uncertainty, right? Because we know the limits of our measurements, especially again in a behavioral science where things are really complex.
Right.
So, and that goes against kind of like we were saying before, like human beings like to judge stuff. Human beings also like black and white. It's this or it's not.
Right.
And it's much easier for journalists to convey things in terms of, okay, so what you're saying is this. We're like, well, sort of, but not really. And if you speak the way that a good scientist should speak, you're saying things like, well, right now the data suggest blah, 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 But, another explanation could be this. We're just not sure yet. That's just not going to be as satisfying as, people should do this because this is true. I think the people that spout the most misinformation are successful because they are making these really black and white claims about things that are just easier for people to think about.
Right.
And if you want to think about truth, you have to acknowledge that there's uncertainty with the data. And that's uncomfortable. People don't like uncertainty. But in science, that's where you live. You live in uncertainty all the time. Relative degrees of certainty and uncertainty, right?
Right.
So, even though we might be really, really, really confident that something is the cause of something else, we're not ever going to say, a good scientist is never going to say the P word. Prove. The P word is only for mathematicians. I don't know. Maybe physicists could argue that. I don't know. To me, I always tell my students, you can say the P word if you're a mathematics student.
Right.
Otherwise, if you're a scientist, you really shouldn't be saying the P word.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the obvious follow-up to that is there a way, or would there ever be a way to effectively communicate that truth without being black and white then? Or is that just sort of, we're doomed to always lose that fight?
That's a really good question. Like, there have to be better ways to convey complexity so that people will not run away with the wrong idea.
Right.
But I think it's probably really, really difficult to convey complexity and have it stay complex.
Right.
Because people don't have time for that. Right?
Yeah.
They're just like, what's the bottom line? What's the take home? And everybody does that. I do that, right? You couldn't get through the door in the morning without having, like these heuristics, So, I think that people that are saying things that are not true, that are also really simple, have a way easier time of conveying that information than people that are conveying true information. And I mean, you saw that in the pandemic too, right?
Right.
That, this works or this doesn't work is way better than, well, we think it works, but we need to run more trials, and like people don't want to hear that.
Right, right.
So, I don't know. That's a good point though. Maybe, is there some intervention that we could come up with? Could we train an entire cohort of school children to tolerate scientific ambiguity,
right,
and be happy about it?
Right.
That would be kind of going against human nature, but I don't know, we could try.
Yeah. It's really interesting because either things are presented in a very black and white way, or if you instill doubt or uncertainty, that uncertainty kind of gets reflected in sort of the black and white sort of idea. Like, for instance, you take the argument of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Well, climate change could be happening, but we don't know if it is or not. And that gets misconstrued as climate change isn't happening, when there is evidence in one direction.
Right.
It's just there are so many different factors here that you can't say for sure exactly what's causing it. There are a multitude of factors, but you don't know what.
Right.
And as long as there's that little bit of doubt, it kind of just ends up getting turned into a sort of more black and white statement. But I guess what I'm wondering too, we talked about the Netflix documentaries, and at least my mind goes back to something like Blackfish or something like An Inconvenient Truth, mm-hmm. where it was possible to convey these complex ideas in ways that a lot of people could digest.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if somewhere down the road we would be able to sort of take influence, inspiration from those things and use that to better convey a message.
Yeah.
So it's hard to really say, though.
I don't know. Something that I read, I think it might have been during the pandemic, is that people that are willing to accept scientific claims are people that really like things like, documentaries about Mars and, from a pretty young age.
Right.
And I started to wonder if because, something that I think we figured out based on some of the political polarization that we've had in the past few years, is that people are going to behave in ways that are consistent with their group that they've identified with.
Right.
And just telling them, actually, you're misinformed, this is what's actually true, is probably not going to change their behavior. That once they've already aligned themselves and have this kind of emotional affiliation with being a member of that in-group, yeah, you can tell them all the, facts that you want, and they're not going to change their mind. Like the vaccine denier sort of situation, right?
Right.
Like once you start to have public affiliation with a group like that, that's your group. I don't know that you can really change anything. And so then I started thinking about, okay, how can we get, I'm a sciencey person. You don't have to be a scientist professionally, but how can we get people to integrate, oh yeah, I'm the kind of person who believes in, the scientific method and empiricism. How can we get people to take on that identity, consciously or unconsciously, so that when they hear that, oh, scientists are saying this, they trust it.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be interesting to try to figure that out.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you bring up there, since I feel like nowadays, even, or at least before, when a scientist would say something, or when, a bombshell study would break out, and it's one that is actually credible, you would see people actually listening to that kind of information. Mm-hmm. And now it's, no matter what is out there, it's always in debate. It's not a question of, oh, the science is there, now what do we do about it? It's more so about, well, what are the qualifications of this person? What is the science like? What, maybe it's all a hoax, who's funding it, and that sort of thing. And not only is it also kind of this, obviously there's this big group mentality, but it's also just this general distrust of anything that comes out.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. It's kind of strange to me, because there's obviously the people who do listen to it. But I feel like at this point, information is not necessarily there in and of itself. It's always used as a weapon to sort of prove a point. And I'm wondering if there's ever going to be, or if there's a way that we can sort of bring it back to, look, this isn't about fighting the other side. This is about, we've got a problem here. We've got evidence supporting that this problem exists. Now, how do we deal with it?
Yeah.
Since, again, at the end of the day, no one really wins or loses if this information happens and we either listen to it or don't. It's either everyone benefits or everyone doesn't. I don't know. It's kind of strange.
But dude, people, like during the pandemic, people were willing to, not get vaccinated against COVID-19 and, be in the hospital on their deathbed and then recover and go, no, I'm still not going to get the vaccine.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what's up with that? I don't know. I don't understand it.
Right.
I kind of think, this idea of, I don't know. I mean, science isn't perfect, right?
Right.
I mean, we've had a, the replication crisis in psychology. Some people know about that, where, there have been some very famous studies that people have tried to replicate
and they just don't.
Can't replicate. And sometimes that's because of, the nature of our scientific process, which is why people are now starting to do more open science, framework sorts of things, where they register a study in advance and they say, this is my methodology, and whatever the data are, I'm going to share all of the data with you so that it's much more transparent. So I think, at least in psychology, we're we're trying to address some of the criticisms. But even with all its flaws, science is still the best way to get information about what's really happening. So, somebody can sit in a congressional hearing or something and say, well, if you're not 100% certain, it's like, but dude, if you had two competing theories and you had more data for one than the other, then I would say, yeah, this one has a little bit less certainty than that one. Let's go with yours.
Right.
But we're talking about my theory, which has lots and lots of data backing it, versus you don't believe anything at all.
Right.
About anything.
Right.
So what do you got? What are you bringing to the table? Where's your solution? Where's your competing theory, right? Science is all about having competing theories go up against each other. Whereas a lot of people that want to dismiss science, they don't have shit on their side.
Right.
They have nothing but, well, if you're not 100% sure, then it's not happening.
Right.
And that's just not going to be a way to live.
Right. It's just never possible to fully, again, P word, prove anything.
Right.
You're
Right.
always going to be acting in some sort of uncertainty. Even if you look at things, from a religious standpoint, religion is not set in stone. Religion has a lot of uncertainty behind it. Even if you believe that God will carry you through this, you have to carry yourself through this as well.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of uncertainty in that. Mm-hmm. Though I guess now I'm kind of just thinking maybe it's not worth trying to entertain that argument, and maybe it's just better to, try to appeal to the people who are unsure. Because obviously there are going to be people who are going to be radical on both sides.
Yeah.
There's obviously people who are radical on both sides. And I think it becomes more appealing to be on both sides when, everything is being fed to them. Everything is being catered to them.
Right.
But there's also a lot of people who I think don't really know how to think or feel about a lot of things, whether it's about, COVID, about even just the general nature of politics. Don't want to brush too much on that because it's unrelated, but just there's still a lot of uncertainty here that I think doesn't fully get shown because obviously the people who are more vocal are going to be heard more. But there's also a big chunk of our population who aren't really sure how to feel. And I'm wondering if there's a way to, specifically go for them, make that sort of space more appealing and try and appeal to them. And hopefully what'll end up happening is that the more extreme edges end up, sort of moving more towards the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to say though.
I really think that at least in the US, it's, I think that our approach to science education at the elementary level has really been lacking, and that we need to, yes, it's important that kids know how to read. It's important that they know how to do math. But I think a lot of curriculums have said, well, yeah, we don't have time to do science. We don't have time to do social studies or whatever it is, let alone like art. But it's not even about let's learn about photosynthesis. It's about the idea that when you have a question, you can get information in a particular way that will help you understand what's going on.
Right.
And having kids be, part of that process and take that on as this is how you approach the world. When you have a question and you don't know the answer, you can get information about it using these systematic processes. And if you can't get the information directly, then there's other people who know about that and they can get information. Not that all questions are going to be answerable by science, but that's how you get information. You don't just say, well, I intuit this.
Right.
Like I had people tell me during the pandemic, just acquaintances, well, I know they're saying this about the vaccine, but I just have this opinion. I just think this.
Right.
Like that's as good as some evidence-based opinion. It's not. Not all opinions are equally good ways to make decisions about your life.
Right.
How you want to worship, whatever, sure, that's your opinion. Go for it. But, you can't you can't just make shit up and say this is equally good when you're talking about, cause and effect and, how to solve problems.
Right, right. Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and actually, I wanted to pivot off of that just to finish off. So you are a developmental psychologist, and going into this, I really wanted your opinion on this. We've sort of seen as a post or pre-pandemic to post-pandemic trend of dropping standardized test scores amongst students, pretty much nationwide. And I think it's fair to say not only with, lack of funding for public education, shortage of teachers, alongside a drastic change in our society and the pandemic, there ought to be a pretty big overhaul in the way we do education. Obviously, what we've been doing doesn't work, or at the very least, it's not working right now.
Yeah.
So I guess my question to you, both as a developmental psychologist, a professor here, as well as a parent for 2 kids, I believe.
They're not kids anymore, Jason. They're
true.
21 and 24. Oh my God, I'm so old.
But my question to you is, how do you feel like we should change education? Because it clearly does need some kind of change.
Yeah. Oh.
It's a pretty big question.
I don't know. I think that I don't know how to do this. I think that we need to respect teachers more, like elementary school teachers, preschool teachers. A lot of kids, by the time they get to kindergarten, are already, quote unquote behind. Now, typically, that might be on the basis of tests, but it's also on the basis of, look, some kids start kindergarten knowing how to read and some kids don't.
Right.
And I think we've historically blamed that on, well, you're not going to a good school. If you were going to a good school, well, that's crap. I think that we as a culture, just like with police officers, we want teachers to solve a lot of problems on our behalf that we have not addressed as a culture. So poverty, income inequality, structural racism, a lot of those things kids bring into schools with them and continue to have to be steeped in the culture. People that have mental health problems that are unsheltered. Well, why is that? Yeah, there's a housing crisis, but it's also because we had a plan for having community mental health clinics in the 60s, and then we defunded that, or we didn't defund it. We never did fund it. So I think a lot of the problems that we have in education are that we're just not really serious about fixing some of the underlying problems that lead to some kids doing well and some kids doing not well. And I think income inequality makes people feel, especially like at the high school level and at the college level, like, man, you better get in that upper echelon, because if you don't, there's 2 categories, poor and not poor.
Right.
And I think until we decide to solve big stuff like that, I think it's going to be hard to address some of the problems that we have in education.
Right. Yeah, so it sort of ends
I have no immediate practical solutions to offer.
Right, because it's at the end of the day, it's or not entirely, but a lot of it is very systematic, right?
Yeah, I really think that. Mm-hmm. I really think that. And, there are, some people might have heard about the Finnish model in Finland. They have like this awesome school system. And apparently people are like clamoring to become teachers because teachers are really, really well respected there. I just think that we place a lot of blame on teachers and, quote unquote, bad schools, when that's not really what's going on there.
Right.
And a lot of we have some of the best education in the world. I mean, people want to come here to go to school, right? So it's not like we don't know how to do it. It's just that we're not doing it very well for everybody.
Right.
So I think that's the bigger problem. I don't think education is necessarily broken. I think it's broken for some people.
Right.
And not for others.
Right. Yeah, I sort of definitely experienced that a lot too. I was very fortunate to go to a good school, get a good education, and now I'm here in Santa Clara University that I think, objectively speaking, is one of the upper echelons of colleges in the country. Mm-hmm. But obviously speaking, not everyone gets that, especially when you think very underfunded communities, maybe districts that have to fund like 8 or 9 public schools and just does not have the money to do that.
Yeah.
A lot of it is basically just, as we were saying before, systematic. It's hard to really fix the key problems when those key problems exist just outside of education.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the school. It's that the school is embedded in a community.
Right.
And so, we can say, oh, it's a good school. It's not a good school. But okay, but what happened before that kid got to school? What happens after that kid goes home from school? We can't take the school out of the community and out of the culture and out of their experience.
Right. 100%. All right. With that in mind, Dr. Whitfield, thank you very much for coming. It's
such a happy ending. But we can try.
Yeah, of course.
We got to fight the good fight, Santa Clara.
Of course. Yeah, if I'm to be honest, though, as much as we kind of do end on a low note, there's a part of me that's not too worried. As much as obviously things are, for lack of a better word, going to shit. Yeah. There is also a lot to be proud of, specifically within our community. Watching the community mobilize in response to COVID, watching the community mobilize in response to a lot of the sort of social awakenings that have been happening.
Yeah.
As much as maybe sometimes the people who we put in power aren't fully there to help us until we really, really raise our voice. Yeah. There is a lot that we as a community or we as communities can really do to help this. And, it's going to be a long fight. It's going to be a long battle, but I do have hope that at the end of the day, things will turn out okay, because there are a lot of people who are fighting for it. And yeah, I don't think it's all doom and gloom on that.
It is regard. Not. Well said. I agree completely.
But with that in mind, Dr. Whitfield, is there anything that you'd like to promote or bring attention to people who might be listening?
Join Psych Club.
Oh yeah, for anyone who
Psych Club is open to anybody. You don't have to be a psych major. You just have to like psych.
Of course. To anyone who's taking classes here at Santa Clara University, we have a psychology club on campus. It's very low commitment. We're just here to do events. As a disclaimer too, I am an officer on that club, so just have to point that out. But yeah, come join us. Come join our events. We have a lot of fun. Also as well, huge shout out to the SU Imaginarium for making all of this possible. Woo! We are in VR lab on HEFI 237. Come in and experience all the technology that we have available if you're interested. There are a lot of projects to get involved. And with that in mind, thank you, Dr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Jason. This is awesome.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, everyone who's listening at home.
Faculty, you should come on the show.
Please do. We're looking forward to a lot of fun conversations that we've had. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you soon. This episode of Ruminations was made possible by Dr. David Zhang and the Santa Clara University Imaginarium. You can check us out on campus at HEFI 237 or visit our website at www.scu.edu/imaginarium.